So something that is coming up in feedback sessions often is where to place highlights. And I've been talking about this in a couple of other videos, but I'll try to make a comprehensive video that ties it all together in a really condensed way. I'm going to start with the general idea that I want you to understand, and then I'm going to walk you through it gradually and how to get. So this is an example of one of my patrons that has the feedback pledge, and they were working on a big muscular dude. There is one misconception that exists here. The thing is that when we use a zenithal light source and not a directional light source, there is always an area that is the brightest, and that is the upper third of a figure. So that's a rule of thumb. It's not always the same way, because in this case, as you can see, figure's hunched over, so it doesn't 100% work here, but just take it as a rule of thumb where the upper third of a miniature, including the face and the head, is usually the brightest area. So what that means is all of this area up here is catching a relatively equal amount of ambient light, so a more general light. So in this case, that means we will probably not have these really dark recesses up here. But in general, you never want this area up here to be as dark as a shadow that is maybe down here. So again, this is not a super great example, but maybe, you know, we can take this. So this is an area that would be shaded, and we never want the same intensity of shadow or similar intensity of shadow up here as we have down here. All of this, of course, depends on the material. So if this was a Space Marine and it's the shoulder guard, then obviously if we want to make that a reflective material, the armor to be reflective, then we have dark areas and really bright areas next to each other just because it's a reflective material. And skin is somewhat reflective, but it's not metal. So we have to highlight accordingly. An example that I prepared so that you can see, okay, there are some areas up here in this upper third of the body. And this is a really extreme example. So you will get these really dark areas like here. But in general, everything that's facing up is not really dark. So I would say the midtone is a mix between this and maybe this here. And then you have like this as a relatively dark area, but it never goes to shadows like down here, right? So this is the darkest shadow here on an area that's curving downwards. So everything that's facing up, we have these rather bright skin tones. Except for this, which is a really dark recess. You can see the muscles go inside here and attach to a bone. But if we compare it to this, this could be really similar. But in general, we try to avoid that. So we can keep this, but I'd still not do it as dark as it is now. This is, I think, a really good picture. So we have all of this area is covered relatively equally. You can see there's a midtone that stretches out over most of this area. And then as the muscles curve down, it gets darker, and then obviously here we have a really dark shadow, but that's again because it's curving inwards, and then everything that's curving downwards is dark too. But up here, this upper third of the body, yeah, there's none of these really deep shadows, and this is a relatively global light, relatively natural light. So this is what we're aiming for. And if we look at the deltoid here, the muscle is split up into 3 groups, and the groups are kind of separated by some grooves, but they don't really get this dark, right? So they're somewhat darker, but they're never as dark as something that curves downwards or inwards. And after we established all of these midtones, we can go for the brightest highlights. One goal of the video is to help you find where to place these highlights after you established all of your midtones. Like you have a really bright highlight here, then here at the sternum, up here on the deltoids, and even here on the pecs, the chest muscles. And then I've been over this in the Myrmidon video. You have these really distinct highlights that go up to where one muscle group integrates into the other, and so on. So if we bring this back here, if we assume a global light, we need to make some adjustments. So we need to find a midtone. I'll just assume this is a midtone. And we have to establish this midtone covering more area and covering more equally. So I'll just quickly do that. Then this area is also a tiny bit too bright. Okay, so this is curving down, so we can keep this darker, and then this curves down and inwards toward the chest muscle, so that's fine too. But in general, we don't want these areas to be super dark. So again, we can keep this somewhat darker, but yeah, we would just have to make sure that the midtone is in all of these areas, and this yeah, even though it integrates here, we will still also keep this a bit brighter. So at this point, we will have to define the rest of the shapes. So I don't want to go as bright yet. So maybe just to have a step in between the brightest highlights and the darker areas where we have a groove that we can define. Let's use this. Right, so here you can see we have a bit of a darker groove that we can still have, because you can see here there is a bit of definition and change of angles of the areas. Also down here. But we don't have these areas up there, up here, that would be similar to this, where it curves inwards and is facing downwards, or yeah, goes into or below other muscle groups, and where it looks this dark. So at this point, we have the midtone established, and then we can work on the highlights. So I kept this because it was relatively nicely positioned. We'll just try to make these a bit more intense, more facing upwards. Maybe like this, and then over here. I'm running across this. So I'm just quickly doing this, just to illustrate my point. And then maybe one last highlight. Again, we can look at this picture and you can see that, especially if there's a strong light, we will have these really intense highlights. And because we have these highlights, the contrast gets increased, and these areas still look dark comparably. They're not as dark as anything that's going on down here. So that's the way we want to keep it. After putting these highlights, I almost feel like these are too dark, but I would have to paint the whole figure here to see if everything works together nicely. So again, the message is pay attention to where your volumes are. You do not want to define a shape that is up here as dark as something that is down here, or even down here, or in the shadows. So this was one of the reasons why I wanted to do this video. I have another example where another patron that is in the feedback pledge did a really nice job on this orc warrior, and he was paying attention to volumetric highlights. So he was aiming for volumetric highlights on the muscle groups and on the face, and he didn't quite do that on the shield. He also sent another picture that we were looking at, and again, if we focus on the upper third of this figure, there is relatively bright highlights, but it's more bright highlights on the edges, and it's not taking into account global lights. And I tried to quote unquote fix that here. We compare these two, you can see that up here I placed some highlights, right? So we need more global light on these areas that face up. We can keep this area relatively dark, but then this area is also facing up. And then anything that is facing up got these more volumetric highlights. Also here and on the shoulders. And I was just focusing on the coat, so we didn't talk about the backpack and all of this, so just coat and helmet. So everything up here needed to be a lot brighter. We could go as far and maybe even add another highlight here. All right, so taking it back to this one, you could still push all of the highlights a bit more, because again, this area up here is the interesting area. This is where a lot of light would catch on. But the problem that this figure had was that he switched between volumetric highlighting on the upper body and the face. And then if we look at the shield, there's edge highlighting. And I've been overlaying his work with my recommendations. So everything that is on the face, for example, can be pushed a lot brighter. So he had a couple of these really bright highlights, but then he didn't go for these bright highlights here. So I sketched those in. And everything here is basically facing up, so it will catch a lot of light. One could argue that this highlight needs to even be wider. And then of course there is, this is a really complicated shield, so there's a lot of different angles, but everything that's facing up, every plane that's facing up should probably catch more light. And I painted this one for the rest of the video to show you exactly what I mean. Let's talk about a few things that you can do to find out where you should place your highlights. And apart from looking at references, one thing that you can do is to just apply a zenithal highlight with an airbrush or a spray can. What I'm doing here is I'm just turning the miniature around in a 45-ish degree angle to the airbrush. Now I'm just applying a white ink from above. And as you can see, we get an indication of where light is hitting. And a lot of this miniature is actually covered by white ink. So there's only very small areas that are in the shadows or would be shaded. So this is a good way to find out where to place your midtones. So all of these areas that are hit by white ink will get a midtone. This is also why using contrast paint through an airbrush on top of this, or inks through an airbrush on top of this, is so effective, because this establishes all your midtones at once, and usually also your shadows, because the black is not going to get stained a lot by the ink or the contrast paint, and you have a perfectly fine established midtone situation that you can work off of and place highlights on. And I always recommend to take a few pictures of different angles here, or just take a quick video with your smartphone, turning it around to get all the angles in. The other thing that I always recommend to do in conjunction with this is to spray the miniature with a satin black primer, and then just light it from different angles and really move your light source around. And this is going to give you a good indication of where your brightest highlights should go. So combining both is, in my opinion, a very powerful tool to first of all see where your midtones need to go, and then you can really get an indication of where your brightest highlights need to go. So for example, if we look at the shield, there is a couple of areas that are really lit. For example, this area and this area here. Interestingly enough, when I move my hand in, you can also see where bounce lights would go. So everywhere my skin is reflecting in the black, you could see where on a really reflective surface you should add some bounce lights. One thing to keep in mind is that both of these approaches are not the perfect way to do it, because we have a black primer and not everything we want to paint is going to be black. We're going to work off of reds or greens. And even in the shadows, those would not be as dark, but this is a really good indication to find out which volumes would cast shadows in a situation like this, which is a zenithal light, which is typically the light source we're going for when painting miniatures. You can turn your light source around to find out other angles, and you can even simulate what we did with the zenithal light spray from above if you move the light really close. But here I just recommend play around, move the light source. Again, if you can, take a video or just take pictures in different angles just to see which of these features catch a lot of light in what situation, and then just decide on where you want to place your highlights. And that is one other takeaway message here. You have a couple of choices of where to put your highlights. Just make them consistent, have a consistent logic behind them, and don't switch them around, and you're good. So this is not a perfect science. Again, perfection is our enemy here. you're not going to find the perfect way to place your highlights. Just make it credible by using these two approaches and sticking to a game plan. So as you can see, I started off of a green, rather saturated green that I mixed with dark sea blue. And if you want to know all the colors that I used, and if you want to follow this paint job further, I'll make a separate video where I mention all of the colors. So there will be a longer video of how I did the skin tones. So what I'm doing here is, as you can see, I'm just applying more of that green, so less blue in the mix, to all of my areas. And this is me trying to find the areas that I need to put my mid-tone on. And yeah, just finding out the areas where I can leave the very darkest shadows. And as you probably realize, I'm going for smoothness here, so that's why I use a couple more layers. And even if it doesn't seem that way, but just using more layers, even in that confined space, and just leaving out very tiny spots of darker color that are not necessarily the darkest color, but I still have the option to leave some of these recesses a tiny bit darker than the coat of paint that I'm applying next. And this is really important. So you can see it here at the ear, for example. I can still leave this really defined by just leaving out or by not touching that area with the next coat of brighter paint. So here we are already rather far in the process, and you can see that I do push the pigments up to where the shape that I'm currently working on is integrating with another shape. And we really want to have all these planes of the face. And of course, this is an orc face. It's a distorted face. There is really large surfaces, large planes that catch a lot of light because his face and the nose part towards the chin is angled so much forward. All of this is going to be hit by a lot of light. And we really want to make sure that most of this is covered. Only the areas that are really just from below are going to be dark. And all of the higher up areas are touched by light. And we have a lot of mid-tone on there. So now I'm already starting to work out the lights. And don't forget that whenever we put a lighter coat of paint on there, the situation changes. So sometimes I will put a highlight on and then I feel like everything is too dark. So that means sometimes I'm going back and I'm taking a darker step in my gradient and I'm applying a darker light, and I'm applying it on that shape, on that volume a bit more. Just because the recess next to it is too dark, like here. Or I apply more of that highlight color on yeah, more of that space. So this is not a super linear process. It is technically linear, but I'm not going to lie to you. I never have this figured out. It's always an exploring process. And that's what I recommend doing. So on that cheek, you just saw me applying a brighter highlight than the base color was there. That's what I mean. Because I went so bright, I needed to go back and make that area a bit brighter too. Because again, we're working with a global light, and the shadow up there, the cheek shadow should be dark, but if it's too dark, it's throwing our eyes off, and we just need to go back. So here, after I established the yellow-green tones, what I'm doing is I'm putting in these highlights that we got from the reference of the black base coat, the satin base coat. And I'm just pushing the lights. And, you know, contrast within a face doesn't mean that we have to go from super dark to very bright. We just have to have a really bright area. And yeah, the recesses don't have to be darkest shadows. They just need to be darker than our bright spots, depending where they are on the miniature. So here I'm going back and you can see that I have the light established, but now I have a bit more of that yellow-green again. And whenever the light is just too harsh and the transitions are too harsh, I glaze over it. And that's going to be a bit of a recurrent theme. And I'm going to talk about it later when we work on the body. But yeah, here I just applied a bit of that reddish skin tone, just so that we have variation in our gradients. And then I'm going back over with the highlights wherever it's needed with a bit of a glazing consistency. And you can totally try to apply the brighter tones from the start, but I just wanted to explore this, and I also wanted it to be smooth, and I wanted to have, again, the possibility to leave some of these recesses up there darker. So working on the back, I'll just want to show you what I do transition-wise, and you have probably seen me do this. If you did watch other videos, I just establish the next layer, and then I work over it with a transparent dilution. So the first application of the layer is going to be opaque, and then I'm thinning down the paint and I'm working on the transitions. So on the back, we have a lot of area that where there's change in angles, and there's a lot of these muscles integrating into each other, like I talked about in the beginning with the bodybuilder pick. So we have these areas that should be darker, but again, they should not be as dark as a shadow like further down, or a shadow that's cast by a really big volume. Here you can see again, whenever I feel like the transition is too harsh, I go back in with a glazing consistency. So the back has a very distinct look. We want to bring out, as you just saw in the reference, want to bring out these tiny shadows below where the spine, the protrusions of the spine come out. So what I'm doing is I'm establishing the light again, a bit careful, and I'm leaving out these areas. And now I'm going over it with more of a glaze consistency, and I'm covering these upper areas, and I'm still leaving out the small shadows, or where the spine protrusions curve downwards. Right, and here you can see we can apply these coats a bit more, you know, consistent, and especially on the neck up here. All of this is bright. There's no, no big curves. So now I'm already putting in the last highlights, or more. We're moving towards the last highlights, and you can see that just a couple of layers are enough to indicate that there's that this is a volume, a bigger volume. And I'm just continuing to push the lights, and as you can see here on the deltoid, I'm just leaving these very tiny lines free. Again, think back to the reference we had. There's not a lot of shadow on the deltoid between these muscle groups, but we can leave a tiny bit of it out, and it's going to look nice. So here on the back, all of that angle or all of that shape is a bit of a plane that's the same, and it's curving downwards a bit further down. So all of that area should catch sunlight, and only the protrusions on the back sticking out will cast a tiny bit of a shadow that's never going to be as dark as anything that's further down. So on the chest, again, if you look back to where the spray coat hit, you can see that the light actually reaches really far down, and we're trying to apply the paint accordingly. And you can see that I cover a lot of space here, and I just leave these very tiny areas out. So I apply the first highlight, the second highlight, and I cover most of this. And then with the third highlight, I start leaving out some of these lines, and it's a recurring theme. You can see me leaving out these lines so that there's a bit more stuff going on in that chest muscle. And then I'm glazing in more and more highlights. But yeah, everything that's facing up is brighter, obviously. And I can leave, since I started from the shadow color, I can leave these shadows out, and I don't have to go back in and shade again. It's totally up to you what you want to do. You could start off of a midtone, but I feel like in this case, you know, trying to figure out where highlights go, this is a good exercise to do, and to try to put on the midtones and just leave out the shadow areas, just like we saw in the reference of the white applied with the spray can or the airbrush. And then push the highlights. All of these areas facing up, like on the neck, just over the chest, all of that is going to catch some light. And again, look at references from bodybuilders. You can see all of these areas, like the sternum, that's not visible here, but the clavicula, yeah, those will catch a lot of light. And it's fine to put really bright highlights there that are not necessarily blended, because that's just how it looks. Sometimes we have these areas catching a lot of light, and there's no transitions because they integrate under another muscle, and you know that plane just will catch a lot of light, and there's no need to paint a gradient there. I just added a bit of color variation again with these red skin tones. And then I moved on to the shield. And here, if we think back to the references that we took with both the spray can and the lights, there is, yeah, this is a spherical shield. And everything that's above the upper lip is going to catch a lot of light. So I'm starting with a really dark tone again, and I'm using opaque colors to bring out the midtone. And my midtone is Mephiston red, I think. And then I'm mixing in an orange, because I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do and how bright I wanted to push this, but I'm just gradually adding, yeah, this midtone, and it needs to cover all of that area. The only areas that I'm leaving out is, and this is a really complicated shield, but sometimes you have these indents where the upper area of that indent is in a shadow, and I'm just leaving that out. But the rest I'm covering really opaque. And as I add a bit of skin tone here, because I eventually decided to have the shield be like a skinned face of a troll or something like that, I wanted to go for skin tones halfway through, so that was okay. I just kept the red as a shadow color, and I started to establish these skin tones. And all the areas that face up, you can always just look at it from above and see all the planes that would catch light. We can just really establish a solid layer on top of these, or on these areas. And I'm feeling my way through it. Sometimes I'm, you know, a bit conservative with the application of layers. Again, you could work off of really solid paint like I do here. You just saw me slap on this opaque layer of paint all over this area on the right. Yeah, and I do the same thing with everything that's facing up. And again, you have these yeah, where we have a change of angle, just below that rivet on top, the middle rivet, we have a darker area there, and I leave that for the sake of establishing a bit of contrast. And that's my midtone basically established, and now I'm moving into highlights. And again, I was taking a reference picture of the black satin base coat lit from above, and now I'm going for exactly these highlights that that I would see, just going brighter by adding a bit of that basic skin tone color. And now I already start to apply some texture. Again, so we have this sharp turn where the spherical part hits the edge of the shield that has a change of angle. We want to define that. Here you can also see that I go back and I re-establish some of that more reddish pink on the outside to be a bit darker, and then I go over the whole thing just for a color variation. You can see the slight orange tint that I have in there. And since again this is a skinned troll, in my opinion, I have some areas that would receive bounce light. So for example, the nose, it's more like a sphere in itself. That shape is a sphere in itself. And I establish a bounce light from below. And wherever I feel like I have a plane, an area that would catch more light, now I'm going in with a really bright color. This is Wolf Gray by Vallejo Game Color. And I'm establishing that last layer of light, my final highlight. And again, you saw me stippling on some parts. Again, contrast. Again, contrast on miniatures is not about going from really dark to really bright in every area. You want to establish really dark areas, like your super shaded parts, and those need to be dark. But as we move towards the brighter areas, we want to have the midtones. We don't want these dark shadows up there. It just doesn't make sense to our eyes. And now contrast means we just go really bright over these midtones, and that's what I'm doing here. And you can also see me stipple on some of these highlights. This is now where we can acknowledge that the skin is probably rough, and I want a bit of texture in there. And I can also just put in a couple of these highlight dots on sharp angles, and you can see again where the spherical part meets that flatter edge. And then I had a bright idea that didn't quite work. I used the contrast paint to bring back a bit of richness again, and it just was not a good idea because it was too glossy in the end. But and I fixed that here. I painted over most areas just once with a different color. But yeah, you kind of want to apply an ink, maybe mix in a bit of matte varnish, or just use a bit of an orange color, just a matte orange, and apply a few glazes just to tint your skin tones or whatever you want to paint a tiny bit to make it look richer, because we were using a bright, almost white highlight color, and we kind of need that in there just to make everything look a bit more rich. So I was finishing out the shield, and I was doing the teeth according to where my light source would be. And again, all of these steps will be in another video. I'm going to do one for the face and one for the shield. And I hope this gives you a good idea of what to do with highlights and where to place them. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to jump on the Discord or put them below the Patreon post. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.